All right, everyone, this lesson will be on filming video and camera settings. We'll also go over some tools that I use to film video as well. First, we're going to talk about shutter speeds, and they're important because they have to do with the other topics that we'll be talking about today. So shutter speed is the time for which a shutter is open at any given setting, and it looks something like this. Next, we'll talk about frames per second, which is frame rate, which is the speed at which images flash in a video. So our eyesight, we see 24 frames per second, and that allows for movement. So in video, imagine that shutter that you saw a second ago, opening and closing 24 times per second. And every time it closes, it captures a photo, it puts them together, thus making video. Wow. And so the more common frame per second that's available on cameras is 24 frames per second. And the purpose for that is to get a cinematic look. That's mostly what you're seeing in the movie theaters, unless there's some slow motion section, or if you're filming an interview. So 24 frames per second allows lips to sync up. Something about it, it looks good. Now, if you go into 60, it starts looking odd. And then if you go into 120 at normal speed, 120 frames per second, it looks really jittery. So the next is 60 frames per second. The purpose for 60 frames per second is to be able to slow it down in post-production or in your software. That is post-production, right? When you take your project, you put it in Adobe, and then you start manipulating, cutting, splitting, making a work of art. So 60 frames per second allows you to slow it down. And I also like to say that it allows for grace. When I was filming weddings, and a shot wasn't super good, I could always slow it down and then take a small segment of that. So you have more footage to play around with when you're shooting higher frame rates, because you can slow it down and all of a sudden a 3-second clip turns into like a 30 or 60-second clip. That requires math. That's probably not right, but you get what I'm saying. You take this tiny clip and you have the ability to make it longer, medium, or 24 frames per second, because that's what you're doing when you're slowing things down. You're slowing the frame rate. There's more data there, which is also why it looks really sexy, right? We get to look at every movement. We get to look at the top side of the screen and then go down to the left before the movement's done and see all of that image. And it's really satisfying. So next we have 120 frames per second. Now 120 frames per second slowed down. Now when you slow these down in Adobe, you go by percentages. So you can bring that all the way down to 20% and you have these real fluid, just contrasty, great video clips, super slow, buttery movement. And so 120 frames per second are for if you want to slow something down really, really slow. Now, if you look closely, you'll see that there is a common denominator here. No pun. No, but really, depending on what frame rate you film at, the shutter speed needs to be set at 1 over 2 times your frame rate of a second. Now I know that's a lot to follow, but look at the frame rate for the 24, 60, and 120, and you'll see what I mean. Shutter speeds are important. Well, I thought that transition would be way cooler than it actually was, but we tried. And so next we will go into aspect ratios. Now, I totally forgot about aspect ratios, but as I started recording my menu on my camera, I realized that certain cameras only allow you a certain aspect ratio when you're picking the frames per second. So we'll get into aspect ratios right now. We'll start with 720. So in 2013, if you had a camera that could film 720, that was awesome. That was super cool. And then 2 weeks later, they came out with 1080. Now they're called aspect ratios because, as you can see here, the 720 is 1280 by 720 pixels, I believe. So that is what you get when you're filming. That's what your sensor picks up. So then you have 1080. Most computers take 1080. Most computers can manage editing 1080. Now, when you move into 4K, then you have a massive file. And it's difficult to edit 4K footage when you don't have a really powerful computer. But the real great thing about 4K footage that I am thankful for is that you can punch into it. So you can crop into your video, which allows you to create different compositions. And you can pretend that you have two different lenses. You can pretend that you have a wider lens and then you have a tighter lens. That cropping in allows you to emulate that 200mm lens. It gets you nice and into the shot. And so those are aspect ratios. Next, we will go to a menu recording of my Sony camera. So this is how we select our aspect ratio and our frame rate. So under file format, you see that we have 4K, this HD is 1080. And then we'll go over to our frame rate. So under record setting, you see that we have 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second, and 120 frames per second in 1080. Next, we'll talk about picture profiles or picture styles. And these are settings that determine the characteristic of your image, including color tones, brightness, and contours. So most cameras have different types of picture profiles, and we will go over 3. The first is log. Now, log is a little tricky to color grade. It's usually the flattest option that you get, and we'll see how this one looks graded right now. There we go. So that is log. The next is cine. Cine's kind of in between. It's not as challenging to grade, and you still get a cinematic look. And then there's the standard picture profile, which the camera comes with, and it usually isn't easy to manipulate or edit. What you get is what you get. And here is a section on audio tools. First, we will talk about the wireless lav. I've shown these in previous videos. This makes for great audio if you're on the run, if you need to do a quick street interview. This is awesome. The next is the shotgun mic that sits right on top. I think this is best for ambient noises if you want to film things, street videography, and have those noises bleed in. And then there is the on-camera mic, which we try not to use, and it sounds a little bit like this. Can you hear the difference? Yeah, just try not to use it, but if it's the only thing you have, go for it. The next thing we have here are more tools. So we're going to talk about the things that hold your camera or that help you film on the go. So the first is a tripod, great for beginners. You can put it in certain areas and create different shots and tell a story that way. Mostly everything I've done in these tutorials has been with a tripod. And the next is handheld. I love hand holding my camera because it allows me to think on my feet. Obviously I miss the focus on this shot, but it's just easy to jump around and not miss a scene when you're doing handheld. And then there's the gimbal. So the gimbal allows you to have a lot of fluid movement. You hold it with 2 hands, or you can put it on a table, and it has a couple automated settings as well. I mostly carry mine and chase people with it. Just keep one foot in front of the other, keep your shoulders low, and keep it steady, and you can get some really crisp shots. Some of the movements in this next video segment that I will show you will be shot with the gimbal. Let's see what these shutters, SPSs, and tools can do. Look at the bottom right-hand corner, and you can see the settings and the tools that I'm using to film this short snippet. And I hope you like that. I'm using a big light source here, which gives it this really great look. And I'm also utilizing the different frame rates, slowing those down to get that slow motion, and utilizing different shots to tell this coffee story. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope this all came together. And next we will go over Premiere and those will be the final videos for these modules.